Welcome to the channel. My name's Stu and this is a story about returning to play electric guitar after putting it down nearly 40 years ago and the lessons learned to get up to speed with the many changes in the music industry when looking to purchase guitars, amps and pedals. So do check out the previous videos, which is the introduction to my journey. So in regard to the previous video, the Multi-Effects GE250 is a great little tool and I'll certainly have uses for it in the studio. But my need to hear a more organic sounding setup looked like it was only going to come from separate pedals on a board powered by an appropriate supply, and yes, you guessed it, back to investigation and watching reviews. This is a Nano Plus Pedaltrain effects pedal board and a Cioks 5 power supply, and I think that's how you pronounce it. Quick disclosure, I'm not sponsored or paid to do this. So I found that digital effects within amplifiers, as good as some of them are, they just didn't work for me. Perhaps I'm old-fashioned, but there's just something solid and real about using physical pedals on a physical pedal board, and frankly, it's also fun. And as I've mentioned before, what's not to like about little coloured boxes with funky designs, and they're just great fun to use. So what was my reasoning to put this board together? Well, number one, I wanted a board that was light, transportable, solid in construction, as small as possible, and with the ability to have a power supply mounted underneath. And that's it. Enter the Nano Plus by Pedaltrain. So as you can see, it's simple in construction and the company has quite a range of these in various sizes. You can actually go onto their website using their graphics facility and lay out the most popular pedals available onto a graphic of the pedal board of your choice. Such a really helpful feature for those of us unfamiliar with what's available these days. So very handy indeed. Now, one of the things to bear in mind, particularly when using mini pedals, is depending on the size of your footwear, you need to think about having the pedals spaced so as not to inadvertently switch two pedals on or off at once, unless of course that's a feature you want. Now I chose the Nano Plus because I also chose to use mini effects pedals, and that gave me the ability to have 6 of them on this type of board. So the board comes with 2 rolls of self-adhesive Velcro tape, and you cut to size for the board and the underside of the effects pedals. Now, most people tend to use the smoother surface of the tape on the pedal board, and that's because it's an open surface. Using the smooth side makes it easier to keep clean. The more knobbly side of the Velcro tape is cut to size and stuck to the underside of the pedals. We'll take a brief look at those pedals and the order they're used in a moment. So before the pedals get stuck into place, we need to look at powering them and linking everything together. Is this important? Yes. Is it complicated? Not for 6 pedals, but even if you're planning to have more, it's important to get this right. And I'll give an example of what can happen when electrical supply is not what it should be. When I started to bring pedals into my playing, I began with an Ibanez Tube Screamer and a Noble's OD1 Overdrive, and these were powered quite happily by a simple 12-volt converter using a connector lead called a daisy chain. I then added an MXR delay pedal, and it was at that point I began to notice if I had all 3 pedals on at the same time, the delay pedal seemed to lose its ability to delay. Even to the point it sounded as if there was no delay effect whatsoever. Now if I switched off one or both of the other pedals, the delay returned to working correctly. And that's a classic case of the pedals drawing more current than the power adapter is designed to deal with. So generally speaking, the more complex the pedal, the more likely it will draw more current. And incidentally, the Noble's OD1 Overdrive pedal is often used with a power supply that can deliver 18 volts, but more on that in a moment. As I was still investigating other pedals that I would require, it was clear it was time for a dedicated power supply. So number 2, I wanted a power supply that would be small enough to hide under the pedal board. It needed to be tough and well built, and it must have a good reputation for build quality and reliability. And after having a good look through various suppliers, I came across the Cioks brand, which is designed and manufactured in Poland. And they come in a range of models, and the Cioks 5 fitted the bill perfectly. And in the box, they also supplied various connecting leads to power a good number of pedals. And it's a really nice little unit, and it feels bulletproof. It has the facility for 5 connecting leads to go directly out to the pedals. And here you can see the ability to choose current flow, depending on the needs of the pedals. They are not inexpensive, I will say that, and you can certainly get cheaper alternatives. But for anyone using their pedals regularly, and certainly if you are actively playing for hire, then you need a robust and reliable unit. And I've mentioned before, having been in the broadcast film industry for many years, there are things you just never skimp on. Cheap gear, more often than not, is a false economy. So briefly, electricity, what do you need to know? And I'll keep this very simple because I'm no electrician or electronics guru. Every pedal requires some form of electrical power, and this can vary depending on the design, the complexity, or perhaps the age of the pedal, such as old technology or even cheap components. So commonly, your pedal may require anything from 9 volts to 18 volts. Now, alongside that, a pedal draws electrical current measured in amps. And if we take this Ibanez mini tube screamer and look at the data, we see it requires 9 volts and draws 80 milliamps. Now, remember my earlier problem with the delay pedal. That's because the adapter I was using is rated at 400 milliamps. And the 3 pedals together were just too close to maxing out the power adapter's ability, hence the drain on power needed. Now the Cioks 5 has 5 outputs. 3 of them are 500 milliamps each, with 2 others 800 milliamps each. So lots of power on tap, and I could easily add other pedals if required. But at the end of the day, you do want a good amount of electrical current headroom, and especially if you're running a lot of pedals for hours on end. So number 3, as mentioned earlier, I wanted to be able to fit the power supply neatly under the pedal board, and the Cioks 5 does that perfectly because it's quite a slim design. Now, using a paper template provided, you need to drill a couple of holes in the pedal board to allow the unit to be screwed into place. And it's important to leave enough room for the mains Europlug to be fitted into the socket. However, before committing to drilling holes, it's a good idea to do a simple test with each of the pedals you're going to use that may be positioned over the actual power supply. Why, you ask? Or you should be asking. Because electrical interference issues can be a problem when particular pedals come into close proximity with a power supply, and the result being an electrical hum is produced, which in turn is magnified through the amplifier or even a PA system. Now, for most modern products, this should be rare, but where there might be budget components used, usually in cheaper products, this might occur. So it's best to test. Now, while all the pedals here are good quality, modern products, nevertheless, I take each pedal plugged into the amplifier and placed over the power supply, switch them off and on to check for electrical interference, and in this case, there's none. But should you have an issue with a favourite pedal, then this may require that the power supply be fitted at a certain place on the board, just keeping it away from the problematic pedal. Now, incidentally, if you do fit a power supply that is deeper than the pedal board frame, you can always use washers or larger rubber feet to the pedal board frame to get the clearance required. Number 4. With the smooth-sided Velcro affixed to the top of the pedal board and the strips cut, using the appropriate Velcro fixing and affixed to the pedals, it's time to lay out the pedals. Number 5. Pedal layout tends to follow an accepted rule, but like most rules, they can be broken if you've got reason to do so. But for this, I'm going to stick to a traditional layout. And here I'm using a polytune. This is a tuner at the beginning of the pedal chain where the guitar actually plugs into, followed by a compressor, and this is followed by 2 overdrive pedals, followed by a phaser, and followed by a delay pedal. Now, I will mention, some folks do like to use the effects loop on their amplifiers if you've got one fitted, particularly for modulation effects such as phasers, flangers, and delay, etc. The reason for this is generally to get the very best modulation effect without colouring from other pedal types used, particularly those that can muddy the signal, such as distortion pedals. All the pedals are connected together by TourTech flat right angled 10 centimeter patch cables, which are lightweight but well suited to the task. As the pedals are fixed, there's no need for heavy duty connectors like these Fender types, which I did use when my pedals were loose on the floor. Power leads provided by Cioks are used to power each pedal, and once again keeping things tidy underneath with short cable runs and cable ties. I've even thought about fitting a small carry handle to the face of the board, but as it is, it's a nice portable unit, easy to handle, and the board comes with a very handy little bag for storage. Well, my choice of pedals. Well, over a decade of playing back in the 70s, early 80s, as I've mentioned before, I've used many effects units, be it on stage or outboard effects through a PA system managed by a sound engineer. But one thing I do remember was how bad so many of the cheap pedals doing the rounds were. These were often tin box affairs that many of us poor musicians used, and they really were tin-plated junk, and they so often, they just didn't sound any different from each other, and flattening 9-volt batteries in a very, very short space of time. These pedals are just so nice by comparison. The Polytuner is very quick to use and very accurate. Next up, an MXR compressor, very handy when needing to tighten the sound, particularly with certain types of guitars. This is followed by an MXR Timmy overdrive pedal. Now, overdrive pedals, you know, I always feel they can be a real headache to get to grips with. I had a love-hate relationship with distortion overdrive pedals back in the 70s, and very much preferred to get my valve amplifiers to give me that organic valve crunch. But of course, the price was definite high volume. The Timmy pedal is a very controllable pedal that doesn't have the harshness or muddiness of so many pedals of its type, and but it does require tinkering with, depending on what guitar I'm using. Next up is the good old Ibanez Tube Screamer. Good with certain types of pickups, and works well with the Timmy when both used together. The MXR phaser is next. And I use this sparingly depending on the guitar being used. And lastly, the MXR carbon copy delay. You know, for such a tiny little pedal, it does a lovely job of adding various delay sounds. And once again, I use it sparingly, so I've no need for more controls that you often find on the larger units, which give you greater variety. Off to one side of the board, I do occasionally use a Dunlop X8 volume pedal, and this is the middle-sized pedal in that range. And for me, it's both a good compromise in size, and yet the volume pot does a decent job of turning the volume signal up and down in a nice sweeping incremental stage, unlike its wee brother. And I have to say, when I looked at that, I found that it just has a poor volume sweep, and it cuts off on and off just far too abruptly. They may have fixed it since the making of this video. So the Nobels OD1 pedal. I really like this pedal, but I'm having noise problems with it, and especially when I'm using it alongside other pedals. And of course, this gets heightened when using single coil and P90 style pickups, which just happens to be most of the guitars that I use. Until I can get to the bottom of this, I'm afraid it's back in its box. And if you use one of these, I would like to hear your comments. Perhaps I'm doing something wrong, or maybe that particular pedal has a fault. I have heard of others having similar issues though. So overall summary. So I've been using the setup for a while now, and all works well. Some folks replace the supplied Velcro tape with a more heavy duty variety because they find the pedals have a habit of moving around. And certainly with live stage work, I could see that as being an issue, particularly if you're heavy with your feet. Back in my gigging days, my pedals were actually bolted onto the pedal board, which was a complete custom build. I don't even remember if you could get a commercially bought pedal board back in the 70s. Perhaps you had one, so comment below if you did. Perhaps the last thing I would say is I've seen a number of videos on people building their own pedal boards out of various materials. Now, I'm no stranger to building equipment, but if finance is an issue and you get all the materials for nothing, then yeah, go for it. Of course, for some folks, they want something that's custom built that suits their personality or perhaps special needs. But generally speaking, the prices for these particular pedal boards, complete with protective carry bag and various accessories, in some cases, I mean, it's really, really hard to beat. So I hope that helps those of you contemplating a pedal board. Please feel free to ask questions, or if you have any helpful points that you want to share, then please do comment below. In the next video, I purchased a particular guitar that would bring another dynamic to my workflow, albeit I needed to fit an extra something to add a little more expression. If you like the content, then subscribing and hitting the usual buttons are much appreciated. So until next time, the journey continues. Take care.